The church hall looked like December had taken a deep breath and decided to be kind. Strings of tiny lights hugged the pillars, and the air carried that mixed perfume of pine-scented polish, warm bodies, and somebody's overconfident cologne. Children in white robes shuffled like sleepy angels, whispering lyrics they would soon forget, while the choir director waved her hands as if she could conduct joy itself. Old women fanned themselves with hymn books, muttering that the generator had better behave, because they did not come to shout carols into darkness. In the front row sat Jackson and Miriam, dressed as neatly as a Christmas postcard, but their togetherness had a careful distance, like two chairs sharing one table, but refusing to touch. Jackson smiled at people in a way that collected compliments the way a bucket collects rain. Miriam smiled too, softer, the kind of smile that said, "I am here, I'm fine, please don't ask questions." When the first hymn rose, it wrapped the hall in sweetness. Yet Miriam's heart kept tapping a private rhythm, the rhythm of bills paid quietly, prayers whispered without witnesses, and the odd comedy of pretending everything is normal. She watched the choir boys sway like young palm trees in a breeze and wondered how a song could sound so light while a marriage felt so heavy. Near the aisle, an usher shushed a giggling teenager with the seriousness of a traffic officer, and Miriam almost smiled. Beside her, Jackson's knee bounced, not from cold, but from appetite for attention. He leaned forward whenever someone important passed, greeting them with a handshake that begged, "Remember my name." Miriam folded her hands and kept her eyes on the altar, as if those lights could teach her how to shine without burning all the way. Jackson had a gift for looking responsible, without doing the boring parts of responsibility. In church, he was the man who knew when to nod, when to raise his hands, and when to drop a loud amen that made heads turn. He could hug the pastor with the confidence of a man who paid the building levy twice, even when his wallet was currently on speaking terms with zero. After service, people called him Brother Jackson with respect, and he accepted the title like it came with a crown. Miriam had once admired that boldness. Now she simply managed it, the way you manage a neighbor's goat that keeps wandering into your compound. At home, Jackson liked labels. Head of the house, provider, protector. But the actual providing often arrived through Miriam's phone, in quiet bank alerts that popped up like small, stubborn miracles. She worked extra shifts, negotiated deadlines, and stretched money the way her mother used to stretch stew, adding water, adding patience, adding prayer. When Jackson's business plans collapsed, he called it bad luck. When creditors called, he called it stress. When the mortgage reminder came, he called it something we'll handle. Miriam handled it. Not with drama, not with speeches, but with receipts. She paid because she loved stability more than arguments, and because she feared what shame would do to Jackson's pride. Still, tonight, as the choir sang about humility, Miriam couldn't help noticing how Jackson sat taller whenever laughter rose nearby, like a man rehearsing for a spotlight. She wondered, with a tired kind of humor, whether pride had a monthly subscription fee too, because somebody was definitely paying. Even his smile looked rehearsed, a suit he wore. Miriam's smile was simpler, stitched from habit, and it kept her upright when she wanted to sigh. The program moved with a careful pace of tradition. Scripture reading, chorus, solo, another chorus, then the pastor's short charge. People swayed, some off-key but confident, as if heaven graded enthusiasm more than pitch. Miriam joined the singing, softly, letting the words pass through her like water through a sieve. Some of it stayed. Some of it slipped away. Jackson sang too, loudly enough to be heard by strangers behind him, and he added extra claps on the beat as if applause could sanctify timing. At one point the choir director announced a special number, and a small boy's voice cracked on a high note. The congregation smiled kindly, because Christmas has a way of forgiving imperfections it would normally gossip about. Miriam smiled too, genuinely this time. And for a moment, she remembered why she still tried. There were pockets of grace in life, even inside tired love. Then the pastor said, "We will take testimonies before we close." And the room stirred with familiar excitement. Testimonies were the church's own living newspaper. People came with stories of healing, provision, and sometimes suspiciously timed breakthroughs. Miriam hoped, quietly, that Jackson would remain seated. Not because she wanted to silence him, but because she feared the way his pride sometimes used words like a cutlass, swinging first and thinking later. Jackson shifted, straightened his jacket, and glanced around as if checking whether the audience was ready. Miriam's stomach tightened with the odd intuition women often carry, that sixth sense that smells trouble before it speaks. Still, the carols played on sweet and innocent, and Miriam kept her face composed, because in public she had learned to hold pain like a wrapped gift, neatly covered, heavy in the hands, waiting for the right moment to open. She knew the ribbon would snap tonight, suddenly. All week, Jackson had walked around the house like a man carrying invisible applause in his pockets. December always did that to him. The season came with endings, and Jackson loved endings because they sounded like awards. He practiced friendliness the way some people practice singing, adding extra warmth when visitors were around. If Miriam mentioned the mortgage, he answered with grand phrases, "God will do it," as if faith could swipe a debit card. And if she mentioned the loan repayment schedule, he called it noise, then switched the television louder. So even his conscience would need subtitles. On Saturday, he shined his shoes until they reflected the ceiling fan, and he told Miriam, half joking, that people needed to see that a man was blessed. Miriam replied with a small laugh that hid 100 thoughts. She had learned that some jokes were just pride asking for permission. By Sunday evening, as the carol service swelled, Jackson's eyes kept scanning the hall, counting who was present, the choir patron, the ward head, the businessman who loved public generosity, and the women who praised men as if praise were a love language. Each time someone greeted him, Jackson stood a little straighter. He loved being greeted. It made his problems feel like rumors. Even the church children knew him, because he had once donated uniforms and made sure his name was announced twice, just in case the angels missed it the first time. Miriam watched him receive handshakes like offerings and wondered not unkindly how a person could be so hungry for admiration and still claim he was full. She had seen hunger like that before, not the hunger of an empty stomach, but the hunger of an empty ego, the kind that could eat a home and still ask for dessert every day. When the pastor opened the floor for testimonies, Jackson's hand rose as if it had been waiting for its cue. Miriam's breath caught. She knew that gesture the way farmers know the first dark cloud. Jackson stepped into the aisle, smiling broadly, and several people smiled back, already prepared to be inspired. He cleared his throat, enjoying the quiet he had caused. "I just want to thank God," he began, and the congregation hummed approval. He spoke about protection, about favor, about how God had kept his home. The words were smooth, polished by confidence. And for a few seconds Miriam hoped the testimony would end there, clean and harmless. Then Jackson chuckled, tilting his head like a comedian warming up a crowd. "You know," he said, "as the head of my home, I thank God I'm strong, because honestly, if I depended on my wife." The pause was long enough to invite curiosity, and curiosity, in church, can be a dangerous thing. Some people leaned forward. Miriam's fingers tightened around her phone, feeling the familiar shape of responsibility in her palm. Jackson continued, louder now. "We would have been homeless by now. She's good-hearted, yes, but useless when it comes to real contribution." A few laughs escaped, quick, surprised, like hiccups. Others froze, unsure whether to clap or pray. Miriam felt the word useless land on her skin like hot oil, and still she did not move. Her face stayed calm because she had mastered that art, wearing peace-like makeup even when the heart underneath is bare. Jackson looked pleased, mistaking silence for agreement, and he added, "A woman should know her place, cooking, praying, supporting, not pretending to be important." The choir lights blinked softly above him, and Miriam thought, with bitter humor, that even the bulbs seemed embarrassed. For a heartbeat, the hall held its breath. The children in white robes stared as if they had forgotten the next line of the carol. A woman near the back covered her mouth with shock. Another man laughed too loudly, the way people laugh when they are trying to hide discomfort, and the sound died quickly. The pastor's smile flickered, then returned, thinner. Jackson, satisfied, gave a small nod as though he had delivered wisdom, and he walked back to his seat, believing truth was whatever he said in public. He sat beside Miriam and whispered playful, "You know, I'm just being honest." Miriam did not turn to him. She stared ahead at the altar, at the soft lights that made everything look forgiving. In her chest, something stung, not like anger, but like the slow ache of being unseen. She thought of the mortgage alert that had come that morning, the one she paid before ironing Jackson's shirt. She thought of loan payments spaced like stepping stones across months, each one a quiet rescue. She thought of how Jackson loved the word useless, because it made him feel useful by comparison. If the moment were not so painful, she might have laughed at the absurdity. A man in God's house boasting about being the roof, while the foundation sat beside him, carrying the weight in silence. Her eyes remained dry. Her face remained composed. She had learned that tears in public often become entertainment for people who have never carried your burdens. A hymn began again, slow, and the congregation joined in with cautious voices. Jackson sang loudly, as if volume could erase what he had done. Miriam sang softly, as if softness was the only way to keep herself from breaking into pieces still there in the pew. When the service finally ended, the closing prayer floated through the hall like a tired apology. People rose slowly, chairs scraping against the tiled floor, conversations breaking out in low, uncertain tones. Some congregants avoided Miriam's eyes, others smiled too kindly, the way people smile when they don't know what to say but feel they should say something. Jackson stood immediately, energized, shaking hands, laughing as though nothing unusual had happened. He accepted compliments on his honesty, nodding gravely, as if courage were a badge pinned to his chest. Miriam remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. She waited for the crowd to thin, not because she was weak, but because strength sometimes needs a pause to breathe. When she finally stood, her legs trembled just slightly, not from shame, but from the effort of holding herself together. She adjusted her bag, smoothed her dress, and followed Jackson down the aisle. Outside, the evening air was cool, sharp enough to clear the throat. Christmas lights blinked along the church fence, cheerful and unaware. Jackson walked ahead, greeting people loudly, replaying his moment like a highlight reel. Miriam walked behind, listening to gravel crunch under her shoes, counting steps, because counting steps felt safer than counting wounds. Someone called out "Merry Christmas," and Miriam replied softly, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She wondered when celebration had become such a lonely activity. The humor of it all was not lost on her. Surrounded by people, music, and faith, yet feeling as though she had just been quietly evicted from her own dignity. She reminded herself to breathe. Breathing was important. Breathing meant survival. At home, Jackson dropped onto the sofa, stretching like a man who had worked hard, while Miriam went straight to the kitchen. Old habits guided her hands. She set the kettle, rinsed cups, moved efficiently. Jackson talked from a living room, replaying reactions, mimicking laughs, exaggerating nods of approval. You should have seen their faces, he said proudly. Truth is hard sometimes. Miriam poured hot water into a cup and watched the steam rise, thin and fragile. She carried the cup to the table and sat down, listening. Jackson did not ask how she felt. He never did after moments like this. He spoke instead about respect, about leadership, about how men needed to be firm. Miriam nodded occasionally, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of noise. Inside her, thoughts lined up quietly, patient as creditors waiting their turn. She thought of her mother's voice long ago saying, "Silence is not always peace, my daughter. Sometimes it's preparation." Miriam sipped her tea and almost smiled at the irony. Preparation indeed. Jackson eventually grew tired of talking and retired to the bedroom, confident sleep waiting for him like a reward. Miriam remained at the table, listening to the house settle. The walls knew the truth. They had heard every late-night calculation, every whispered prayer. She sat there, still, not angry, not loud, just awake. Later that night, when the house had fully surrendered to sleep, Miriam stood and walked to the small cabinet near the dining area. She unlocked it with a key she always carried, not out of secrecy, but necessity. Inside was a neat folder, edges worn from use. She placed it on the table carefully, as though it were something alive. Receipts lay inside, arranged by date. Bank alerts printed and filed. Loan clearance letters folded with precision. Property documents resting quietly at the bottom, patient and undeniable. Miriam ran her fingers over the papers, feeling an unexpected calm. This was not revenge, it was evidence. She thought again of Jackson's word, useless, and let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. If useless paid mortgages, cleared debts, and kept roofs over arrogant heads, then perhaps the word needed redefining. She closed the folder gently and locked it away. Tomorrow, she knew, would look different, not outwardly, not loudly, but deeply. She went to bed without waking Jackson. As she lay in the dark, listening to his even breathing, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not anger, not sadness, decision. For years, Jackson had lived comfortably inside assumptions. He assumed money would always come back. He assumed respect could be demanded. He assumed Miriam's silence meant agreement, or worse, emptiness. He never noticed the way she stayed up late after he slept, the glow of her phone lighting her face as she negotiated deadlines and balances. He never noticed how often she paused before answering calls, bracing herself for numbers and voices that carried weight. To Jackson, bills were inconveniences that interrupted his confidence. To Miriam, they were responsibilities that demanded attention. She learned early how to stretch herself thin without tearing. She took on extra work quietly, not announcing promotions or overtime. When his business began to fail, Jackson blamed enemies, fate, and timing. Miriam blamed nothing. She simply acted. She paid the mortgage because losing the house would have been louder than her pride could bear. She cleared loans because humiliation had a way of spreading if left unpaid. Creditors learned her voice, calm and firm. "Yes, it will be settled," she would say, and it always was. There was a strange humor in how people thanked Jackson for stability, never realizing stability had Miriam's fingerprints all over it. She did not correct them. Correction required energy, and she was already busy holding everything up. Jackson's avoidance became routine. When letters arrived, he skimmed and dropped them. When reminders came, he delayed. Miriam intercepted quietly, like someone catching falling plates before they shattered. She told herself she was protecting peace. Maybe she was protecting him. Or maybe she was simply afraid of what would happen if the truth came out too loudly. Still, each payment strengthened her spine, even as it fed his ego. He wore confidence like perfume. She wore endurance like skin. The contrast amused her sometimes in a tired way. When Jackson bragged about being a provider, Miriam would nod, wondering if providers knew what interest rates felt like at midnight. She kept records not because she planned to use them, but because organization made chaos less frightening. In her world, numbers told the truth even when people lied. And the truth was simple. She was carrying far more than anyone saw. She wondered occasionally if Jackson truly believed his own words, or if he simply enjoyed the echo they made. Either way, his blindness had become deliberate. And deliberate blindness, she knew, was dangerous. The morning after the carol service, life continued as usual. Jackson woke cheerful, humming as he dressed, pleased with himself. Miriam prepared breakfast, efficient and quiet. There was no confrontation, no dramatic pause. That was the thing about her strength. It did not announce itself. Jackson left the house feeling tall, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting inch by inch. Miriam watched him go, then sat alone at the table, sunlight creeping across the floor. She felt an odd sense of relief, like someone who had been holding her breath for years and finally exhaled. She realized then that silence had done its job. It had preserved facts, protected documents, and allowed truth to mature. Whatever came next would not need shouting. Truth, she had learned, did not need volume. It only needed time. By the time the week settled into its usual rhythm, Miriam had already decided, not in anger, not in tears, but in clarity. Decisions made in clarity felt different. They did not shake. They did not rush. They simply existed. She stopped intercepting Jackson's responsibilities. When his phone rang with unfamiliar numbers, she let it ring. When emails arrived marked urgent, she left them unopened. This was not cruelty, it was honesty. Jackson noticed small changes, but misread them as mood. He joked about it, saying she was finally relaxing. Miriam almost laughed. Relaxation, for her, looked like boundaries. She continued paying what needed to be paid, but she paid as herself, not as his shadow. She reviewed documents again, ensuring everything was in order. Each paper felt like a sentence in a story Jackson had never bothered to read. She felt no rush to confront him. Confrontation was loud. She preferred inevitability. Somewhere inside her, patience transformed into resolve. She was done protecting illusions. At night, while Jackson slept, Miriam thought about how humiliation worked. It was rarely about truth. It was about power. Jackson's words at church had not revealed her weakness. They had exposed his need to dominate. That realization freed her. She no longer felt the urge to explain herself to anyone, including him. She knew what she had done. The house stood because of her. The debts disappeared because of her. If Jackson wanted to keep performing strength, she would let reality handle the curtain call. There was a quiet humor in watching someone boast about a bridge they had never built, while standing safely on it. Miriam smiled faintly at the thought. Life, she knew, had a way of correcting exaggerations. By Friday, the bank had completed its processes. Everything Miriam had arranged long ago simply took effect. No drama. No announcement. Just signatures, confirmations, and finality. Jackson remained unaware, still basking in echoes of praise. Miriam moved through her days with calm precision. When Sunday approached again, she dressed carefully, not for appearance, but for steadiness. She knew the week ahead would ask questions she was ready to answer. As she stepped out of the house beside Jackson, she felt grounded, like a woman who finally understood her own weight and no longer feared it. The church bells rang in the distance, calling people in. Miriam walked forward, composed, carrying nothing extra. For the first time in a long while, she was not holding the entire house on her shoulders. She had placed the truth gently where it belonged. And truth, unlike pride, never rushed. It always arrived exactly when it should. The call from the bank came on a Tuesday morning, polite and unremarkable. Jackson answered it with the casual confidence of a man who believed institutions existed to accommodate him. The woman on the line spoke carefully, using his full name, inviting him to come in to clarify a few matters. Jackson agreed immediately, already imagining himself leaning back in a chair, correcting assumptions, perhaps even negotiating something new. He ended the call smiling, tapping his phone against his palm like a lucky charm. When he mentioned it to Miriam, he made it sound like an opportunity. They probably want to restructure something, he said lightly. Miriam nodded, her expression neutral, the way one nods when rain is announced after clouds have already gathered. She did not ask questions. She did not warn him. She simply returned to what she was doing, stirring soup with slow patience. Jackson mistook her calm for ignorance. He had always underestimated silence. To him, quiet meant empty space, not stored power. He dressed carefully for the appointment, choosing his best jacket, rehearsing confidence in the mirror. He left the house with the air of a man stepping into confirmation, not confrontation. Miriam watched him go, listening to the gate click shut. She did not follow him with her eyes for long. Instead, she sat down, folded her hands, and allowed herself a breath she had been holding for years. Somewhere inside her, a chapter was closing itself neatly, without ceremony. The bank smelled like polished floors and seriousness. Jackson signed in, greeted staff warmly, dropped familiar jokes. He was ushered into an office where two officials waited, their expressions courteous but firm. As they spoke, something shifted. Words like documentation, ownership, and authorization floated across the desk, heavier than they sounded. Jackson leaned forward, confused, then laughed nervously, assuming there had been a mistake. Mistakes were for other people. The officials slid papers toward him, asking him to review them. He skimmed at first, then slowed. His smile faded. Names appeared where he did not expect them. Miriam's name. Dates he did not remember signing. Payments he had never made. His fingers tightened around the pages. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the hum of the air conditioner. "There must be an error," he said. The officials shook their heads gently. "No error. Everything was in order. The house legally registered. The loans fully cleared. The privileges he enjoyed, conditional and now withdrawn." Jackson sat back, stunned. For the first time in a long while, confidence failed to arrive on cue. The room felt smaller. The words useless echoed in his mind, uninvited, unwelcome. He left the bank slower than he entered, jacket still neat, pride quietly fraying. Outside, the sun shone as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. Life continued. Jackson stood for a moment, staring at his reflection in the bank's glass doors, trying to recognize the man looking back. He felt exposed, as though something essential had been revealed without his consent. On the drive home, he rehearsed explanations, dismissals, jokes. He told himself Miriam had overstepped. He told himself he was still in control. Control, he realized uneasily, was easier to claim than to prove. By the time he reached the house, irritation had replaced shock. Anger was more familiar. He walked in ready to laugh it off, to minimize, to reclaim space. Miriam looked up from the table, calm, present. Their eyes met. For a second, Jackson hesitated. The humor he usually used like armor failed him. He spoke anyway, scoffing lightly. "You think paperwork changes anything?" Miriam said nothing. Her silence landed heavier than accusation. Jackson felt something unsettling crawl up his spine. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. And awareness, he would soon learn, was the beginning of consequence. That evening, Jackson paced the living room, waving irritation like a flag. He talked loudly, as if volume could rearrange facts. "You went behind my back," he accused, though his voice wavered between anger and disbelief. Miriam listened from her seat, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady. When she finally spoke, it was without heat. "I didn't go behind you," she said. "I went ahead of collapse." The words landed cleanly, without insult. Jackson scoffed, trying to recover ground. He joked bitterly, saying money had made her bold, that she was trying to embarrass him. Miriam did not rise to it. She explained, simply, what she had done and why. Mortgage payments, loan clearances, years of quiet effort. She did not list sacrifices dramatically. She did not cry. She spoke as one might read a report, accurate, complete, final. Jackson listened, the room growing uncomfortably still. For the first time, he could not interrupt her with laughter. Each sentence stripped away a layer of his performance. He realized slowly that the applause he loved had never paid a single bill. The realization did not humble him immediately. It wounded him first. He tried to reclaim authority through mockery. "So now you're the head of the house?" he sneered. Miriam met his gaze. "No," she replied. "I've always been the foundation." The sentence was quiet, but it cracked something open. Jackson sat down, suddenly tired. His anger deflated into confusion. He did not know how to argue with facts. Facts did not shout back. They simply waited. Miriam stood and gathered the folder from the cabinet, placing it gently on the table. She did not push it toward him. She did not demand acknowledgement. She allowed it to exist between them, like a mirror. Jackson did not open it. He already knew what was inside. Pride had taught him many things, but it had not prepared him for this, being saved by someone he publicly diminished. The irony stung sharply. If humiliation had weight, he felt it now, pressing inward instead of outward. That night, Jackson slept poorly. He turned, restless, his mind replaying moments he had dismissed. Late payments Miriam never mentioned. Calls she took outside. Calm responses where he expected panic. He realized how much she had protected him from himself. The thought was unbearable. By morning, the house felt different. Quieter. Not tense, honest. When Sunday approached again, Jackson felt dread for the first time. Church had always been his stage. Now it felt like a place where truth might follow him. Miriam prepared for service calmly, unchanged. Jackson watched her, unsure how to speak. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, to shrink what had happened. But something in Miriam's composure warned him. Noise would not save him now. As they stepped out together, Jackson felt the weight of eyes he could not yet see. Consequences, he was learning, did not rush. They arrived steadily, like hymns sung in unison, impossible to silence once they began. The next Sunday arrived with a seriousness Jackson had never associated with church. There were no careless jokes on the way out, no confident humming. The bells rang the same, but they sounded heavier to him, like questions instead of invitations. Inside the sanctuary, Jackson felt eyes without knowing who was looking. He sat beside Miriam, aware of the space between them, not distance, but balance, as if she had finally set something down. The service moved quietly until, after the closing hymn, an usher approached them with respectful firmness. "The pastor would like to see you both," he said. Jackson's chest tightened. Miriam stood calmly, smoothing her dress, and followed without hesitation. The room they were led into was modest, chairs arranged in a circle, Bibles resting on laps. The pastor and church elders sat waiting, their expressions calm but intentional. No anger, no accusation, just concern sharpened by responsibility. Jackson felt exposed in a way applause had never prepared him for. The pastor spoke gently but directly. "What was said during the Christmas carol service caused concern," he began. "A husband's words can uplift or wound. We need to understand why such a remark was made." Jackson shifted, instinctively reaching for humor, but the room did not receive it. The elders listened closely as he tried to explain himself: jokes, honesty, exaggeration, stress. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last. Miriam was asked to speak. She did not dramatize. She did not defend herself aggressively. She simply said the truth had already been spoken, just not by her. The elders exchanged glances. Silence stretched, not awkward, but instructive. Jackson realized something unsettling. The absence of noise had given his words too much room to echo. The elders reminded him of dignity, of partnership, of how public humiliation lingers long after laughter fades. Jackson nodded, shame beginning to replace resistance. He had come to church expecting blessing. He was leaving with accountability. When they exited the room, Jackson felt smaller, not because he was attacked, but because he was finally seen clearly. Miriam walked beside him, unhurried. Outside, sunlight touched the church walls warmly, as if forgiveness was still possible, but not automatic. Jackson wanted to speak, to apologize immediately, to fix something. But he did not yet know how to apologize without protecting himself. Miriam sensed this and said nothing. Some lessons, she knew, required space to settle. As they walked home, Jackson felt the applause he once loved dissolve completely. In its place stood something unfamiliar and uncomfortable: reflection. News traveled faster than Jackson expected. By midweek, Miriam's family knew. It began with a phone call, one of those that start calmly and end with raised voices. Her brother was the first to speak, anger sharp and protective. Her mother followed, her disappointment quieter but heavier. They came to the house unannounced, filling the living room with the kind of fury that had been waiting years for a reason. Jackson stood, stunned, as Miriam's family recounted the story back to him, each retelling sharper than the last. "In church?" her cousin demanded. "During Christmas?" Her uncle shook his head slowly, as if ashamed on Jackson's behalf. They did not ask if it was true. They had already decided. To them, the humiliation was not a mistake, it was a revelation. They turned to Miriam, voices firm, insistent. "Enough is enough," they said. "Discard him immediately." The word discard hung in the air, final and forceful. They listed reasons: respect, dignity, precedent. They reminded her of her worth, of how long she had endured quietly. Jackson watched, powerless, as his authority evaporated in the face of collective outrage. He wanted to argue, to explain, but no explanation could compete with anger sharpened by love. The irony stung deeply. The people he had humiliated were now the ones being defended fiercely. Miriam listened to her family carefully, her face calm but thoughtful. She understood their anger. She felt it too, in quieter ways. But something in her resisted being pushed, even in her own defense. When Miriam finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I won't decide out of fury," she said. The room fell silent. Her family protested, shocked. They accused patience of weakness, silence of delay. Miriam shook her head gently. "This is my marriage," she said, "and my decision will not be forced." Jackson looked at her, stunned. He had expected rejection. What he received instead was something far more uncomfortable: restraint. Her refusal to discard him immediately was not forgiveness, it was control. The family left reluctantly, warning her, promising consequences if she wavered. When the door closed, the house felt emptied of noise, but full of meaning. Jackson sat heavily, realizing that Miriam had just stood against her own people, not for him, but for herself. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could. The weight of everything finally crushed Jackson's defenses. He stopped pretending. Pride, stripped of audience, could not survive. He returned to the church alone one evening, meeting again with the pastor and elders, this time without jokes, without excuses. His voice broke as he admitted what he had never said aloud, that he had been wrong, that his pride had spoken where gratitude should have lived. He apologized openly, not for appearances, but because the truth had cornered him. The elders listened, not celebrating his humility, but acknowledging it. They reminded him that repentance was a beginning, not a conclusion. Jackson nodded, understanding that forgiveness was not a transaction. It was a process he could not rush. Later, at home, Jackson stood before Miriam, stripped of performance. He begged forgiveness, for patience, for the chance to rebuild what he had damaged. His voice cracked, the sound unfamiliar to him. He did not demand an answer. He only asked to be heard. Miriam listened, her face unreadable. When he finished, silence settled between them, not heavy, not cruel, just honest. She did not respond immediately. She did not promise anything. She simply looked at him, measuring words against years. Jackson realized then that apologies did not erase memory. They only acknowledged it. That night, Miriam lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing everything. She felt no rush to decide. For the first time, time belonged to her. Jackson lay beside her, awake as well, aware that humility did not guarantee restoration. The house stood quietly around them, walls holding stories of endurance, pain, and unspoken strength. Somewhere in that silence, a future waited, uncertain, unresolved, but real. And Miriam, finally free from carrying everything alone, allowed herself to wait before answering. Days passed after Jackson's plea, slow and deliberate, like time itself was watching before taking the next step. The house did not erupt into arguments or sudden reconciliation. Instead, it settled into an unfamiliar quiet, one that did not feel hostile, but thoughtful. Jackson woke earlier than usual, not out of discipline, but restlessness. He moved carefully around Miriam, as though noise itself might offend her. He made breakfast once and nearly burned it, standing too long lost in thought. Miriam thanked him politely and ate in silence. The absence of rejection confused him more than anger ever had. He had prepared himself for shouting, for cold dismissal, even for being asked to leave. What he was not prepared for was being ignored gently. That kind of distance forced reflection. Without applause, without confrontation, Jackson had to sit with himself. And for the first time, there was nowhere to hide. At church, Jackson felt the shift immediately. No one mocked him, no one scolded him, but conversations slowed when he approached. Familiar warmth had cooled into cautious courtesy. The elders greeted him kindly, but without the easy smiles he once enjoyed. He realized then that reputation did not disappear in one dramatic moment. It eroded quietly. Every handshake felt lighter. Every God bless you carried pause. Jackson understood now that public words lived long lives. He sat through service without lifting his hands, listening instead. Hymns about humility sounded different when pride had finally been exhausted. Across the aisle, Miriam sat composed, not seeking sympathy, not performing pain. Her calm unsettled him more than gossip would have. He wondered how long she had lived like this, steady underweight, unseen yet unbroken. At home that evening, Jackson tried again, not to beg, but to speak honestly. He acknowledged things he had never admitted before: fear of failure, jealousy of Miriam's quiet competence, the need to feel larger by making her smaller. His voice trembled, not theatrically, but genuinely. Miriam listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded slowly, as if filing his words somewhere important. Still, she did not respond. Jackson realized then that forgiveness was not something he could schedule. It was not a reward for confession. It was a decision Miriam would reach in her own time, if at all. And for the first time, he understood that waiting was part of repentance. Miriam began to reclaim pieces of herself she had long postponed. Not dramatically, no declarations, no symbolic gestures, but practically. She rearranged her schedule, declined unnecessary obligations, and took long evening walks alone. These walks were not escapes, they were recalibrations. She thought about marriage, about endurance, about how strength had followed her quietly for years like a shadow she never acknowledged. She remembered the moment in church when Jackson's words landed, and how she had stayed seated, not out of weakness, but instinct. That instinct now guided her again. She was not rushing to forgive because she had learned the cost of premature peace. Peace that arrived too quickly often demanded silence in exchange. Miriam no longer wanted peace that required her to disappear. Jackson watched these changes with a mix of hope and fear. Miriam was not shutting him out, but she was no longer centering him either. That shift frightened him more than anger would have. He realized how much he had depended on her constancy while taking it for granted. Now that constancy remained, but it belonged to her first. He began making small changes without announcing them, clearing his debts properly, taking responsibility for finances, speaking less and listening more. He did not present these changes as proof. He treated them as obligations. Whether they would matter to Miriam remained uncertain. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where Miriam had once sorted receipts in silence, Jackson looked at her and understood something vital. The outcome was no longer his to control. Miriam had carried the marriage alone for too long. Now, she was choosing whether it deserved to continue. And that choice, unspoken, unresolved, hung between them with quiet authority. Miriam met his gaze briefly, then looked away, not in dismissal, but contemplation. Her silence was no longer endurance. It was judgment forming. As days blended into weeks, Jackson began to notice a strange shift, not in Miriam, but in how the world responded to him. People no longer assumed his authority. They observed it. At work, conversations became more direct, less deferential. Decisions that once passed without question were now examined. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Jackson realized that respect, once cracked, invited inspection. At church, he volunteered quietly, no announcements attached. He stacked chairs, cleaned hallways, arrived early, and left late. Some people noticed. Most didn't. And that, he was learning, was the point. Humility did not ask to be seen. It worked unseen, trusting time to speak. Jackson struggled with this invisibility. It felt like fasting after years of feasting on attention. Yet somewhere in the discomfort, he felt lighter. For the first time, his actions were not performances. They were repairs. Miriam observed these changes without commentary. She neither encouraged nor discouraged him. She had learned that accountability, sustained by praise, often collapsed when praise disappeared. Instead, she focused inward. She reconnected with friends she had distanced herself from during years of quiet carrying. She laughed more freely, slept more deeply, and felt less urgency to manage outcomes. Her sense of self, once stretched thin by obligation, began to return to its natural shape. She realized how much emotional labor she had performed without recognition, and how liberating it felt to stop. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not an obligation. It was a gift she had the right to withhold until she felt safe again. One evening, Jackson mentioned counseling, not as a plea, but as an intention. Miriam listened. She did not respond immediately, but she noted it. For the first time, Jackson was choosing growth without demanding reward. The difference mattered. Still, Miriam did not soften. Not yet. Trust, she knew, was not rebuilt by gestures alone. It required consistency over time. And time, at last, was on her side. The pastor reached out again, this time inviting Miriam alone for a conversation. There was no urgency in the request, only care. Miriam attended willingly, sitting across from familiar faces who had watched her endure quietly for years. They spoke gently, acknowledging the weight she had carried and the dignity she had maintained even when wounded publicly. They did not pressure her to forgive. Instead, they asked what she needed. The question surprised her. Miriam realized how rarely anyone had asked that before. She answered honestly, space, time, and proof, not promises. The elders listened and nodded. They reminded her that forgiveness did not erase responsibility, and reconciliation did not have to be immediate. Marriage, they said, was sacred, but so was wholeness. Miriam left the meeting feeling affirmed rather than instructed. It was a relief to be treated not as a wife who must endure, but as a woman who mattered. Jackson, when told about the meeting later, did not protest. He did not ask what was said. He accepted the silence as part of his consequence. That night, Miriam reflected on how far she had come. Not from Jackson, but from erasure. She realized that whatever decision she eventually made, it would be made from strength, not fear. And that realization settled her spirit. Forgiveness, if it came, would be deliberate. And if it did not, she would still be whole. Jackson learned patience the hard way. He stopped asking questions that pressured Miriam for answers. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his behavior, his words, his consistency. He stopped explaining himself and started showing up, reliably, quietly. He took full responsibility for finances now, not with pride, but with diligence. When mistakes happened, he owned them immediately. The change was slow, imperfect, but visible. Jackson understood now that repentance was not a moment, it was a lifestyle. Miriam noticed. She always noticed. But noticing did not mean surrendering. She allowed herself to feel cautiously hopeful, without committing to an outcome. Hope, she learned, did not have to be loud to be real. Some evenings, they spoke easily again. Other nights, silence returned. But the silence was no longer heavy. It was spacious. Miriam felt no guilt for withholding resolution. She had spent years resolving everything for everyone else. Now, she allowed uncertainty to exist. Jackson wrestled with regret, not just for what he had said, but for what he had failed to see. He recognized how he had mistaken Miriam's strength for passivity, her patience for permission. That realization humbled him deeply. He knew now that even if Miriam chose not to continue the marriage, the lesson would remain, and it would shape him forever. On a quiet Sunday evening, Jackson sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, reflecting. Miriam joined him briefly, sitting across from him rather than beside him. The space between them felt intentional, not cold, not hostile, just honest. Jackson spoke softly, not to persuade, but to acknowledge. "I know I broke something," he said. "I don't expect answers yet. I just wanted you to know I understand what I lost." Miriam listened carefully. When he finished, she nodded once. "Understanding is a start," she replied. It was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. Miriam stood and returned to her room, leaving Jackson alone with that sentence. He felt neither relief nor despair, only acceptance. Some doors, he understood now, opened only when pushed by time and truth together. And some doors remained closed to protect what lay behind them. That night, Miriam prayed, not for clarity about Jackson, but for clarity about herself. She slept peacefully. The story did not end with reconciliation or separation. It paused instead, right where growth was possible and consequences still mattered. Miriam had reclaimed her voice without shouting. Jackson had learned humility without applause. And between them stood a future that would be decided not by pressure, but by sustained change. As word quietly spread that Jackson was changing, reactions were mixed. Some people believed growth should be applauded immediately. Others believed damage required time before trust could even be discussed. Jackson learned not to chase either group. He focused instead on consistency, the kind that survives boredom. He showed up when no one was watching. He corrected himself when old habits tried to resurface. There were moments when pride crept in, whispering that he had done enough, that he deserved resolution by now. Each time, he pushed the thought away. He had learned that entitlement was simply pride wearing patience as a disguise. Miriam felt the shift too, but she was careful not to romanticize it. Change, she knew, could be real and still insufficient. She allowed herself to acknowledge Jackson's efforts, without letting them dictate her decision. Her days felt lighter now, not because everything was resolved, but because she no longer carried responsibility alone. She had reclaimed her inner balance, and with it came discernment. For the first time in years, she was not asking herself how to save the marriage. She was asking whether it deserved saving. One evening, Miriam sat with her journal, writing thoughts she had long swallowed. She wrote about dignity, about silence, about how love without respect eventually becomes labor. She wrote about how humiliations linger longer than apologies, especially when witnessed. When she closed the journal, she felt calm. Not because she had decided, but because she no longer feared the decision itself. Jackson asked to speak one final time, not to plead, not to negotiate, but to close the season of uncertainty respectfully. Miriam agreed. They sat across from each other again, the familiar table between them, now a symbol of truth rather than endurance. Jackson spoke first, carefully. He acknowledged that forgiveness was not owed. He admitted that even if Miriam chose to walk away, the lesson would remain carved into him. "I needed to lose your silence to understand its value," he said quietly. Miriam listened, her face composed. When he finished, she spoke at last, not with accusation, but clarity. She told him how deeply the humiliation had cut, not just because of the words, but because of where and how they were spoken. She explained that trust was not broken in one moment, but revealed in that moment. Jackson nodded, tears threatening but controlled. For once, he did not defend himself. Miriam ended the conversation gently. "I see your effort," she said. But seeing effort is not the same as feeling safe again. Jackson accepted the words without argument. They sat in silence afterward, not strained, not hostile, just honest. When they stood, both understood that whatever came next would not be rushed or forced. In the days that followed, Miriam became clear, not suddenly, not dramatically, but firmly. She realized that forgiveness did not have to end in reunion. It could exist alongside distance. One morning, she told Jackson her decision. She would not discard him in anger. She would not shame him publicly. But she would step away from the marriage, not as punishment, but as preservation. Jackson listened without interruption, the weight of the moment settling fully. He did not beg. He did not argue. He simply nodded, accepting the consequence of delayed realization. Miriam's calm did not come from coldness. It came from closure. She had forgiven him enough to let go without bitterness. That forgiveness, she knew, was for her own peace. Arrangements were made quietly and respectfully. There were no dramatic exits, no public announcements. Just two people acknowledging that love without respect could not continue, even after repentance. Jackson moved out, humbled but wiser. Miriam remained, grounded and whole. Months later, Miriam attended another church service, this time sitting alone, unburdened. The carols played again, familiar and gentle. She sang freely, no weight on her chest. When testimonies were called, she did not stand. She no longer needed to prove anything. Her life spoke well enough. Jackson, elsewhere, lived differently now. Quieter, more deliberate. The lesson Miriam taught him would follow him for life, not as resentment, but as truth. He no longer confused volume with value. As the final hymn rose, Miriam smiled softly. She had not shouted. She had not fought. She had simply stopped shrinking. And in doing so, she discovered the most powerful ending of all. A woman who chose herself, without losing her grace. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end.